Oh, let me hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
My name is Atene Sadik, and I'm going to be um,
Okay. Opening government. Please read the motion. OG, please read the motion. Opening government, please read the motion. Closing opposition, please read the motion.
This House opposes the implementation of the CBDR principle.
Closing government, please confirm that you have the same motion.
Yep. Yeah, we do have the same motion. I think Queen is trying to speak. If you're trying to speak, I think Queen, you should like try reconnecting because we don't hear anything.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Opening government. The go ahead is you are going to iron this round if your partner does not show up, but you cannot iron semis. So you have been allowed to proceed. And hence, if you are still alone, you can still debate alone. I hope
All right.
that's clear for you. Okay. So if that's the case, please read the motion to confirm that you're audible.
This House opposes the implementation of the CBDR principle.
Okay, with that being said, 7 minutes, 15 seconds as usual. Please ask POI. This goes to the rest of the debate room. That's how we can make the comparatives easier. What's your POI preferences? Timer is in the chat space. Best of luck to everyone.
Okay. Please, I would really appreciate POIs in the chat space. I have no gender preferred pronouns. Just refer to me as Prime Minister for the best. Okay. EM, if you want to use gender pronouns, I would really appreciate POIs, particularly from closing opposition. So let's go. I'll begin my speech in. Sorry, Chair, the timer is 7 minutes. It should be 7 minutes, 15 seconds.
I will give you your 15 seconds after the 7 minutes are over.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think that the core idea behind the CBDR principle is to, one, salvage developing nations from the huge cost of going green, and two, make them have an hedge to say they also need to develop, right? And so opposition may want to argue around that line. So let's preempt them ahead of time. We think that two things. Firstly, developing nations can survive and grow regardless of the cost of going green. Why? They have things like agriculture that exist for them. They have things like a huge level of mineral resources that is located within their area that they can necessarily rely upon to get their emancipation, and a huge level of wealth, something that is even more trusted than this crude oil or whatsoever may be causing climate change effects. Secondly, is that developing nations have problems of corruption and a whole lot of mismanagement and bureaucracy. Their democracy is still very much young, which means regardless of whatever option you give them, they are more likely going to still struggle in the long run. Third reason is that developing nations are largely dependent on developed nations for things like amnesty, things like reparations, things like technical know-how, where they have to bring in people from overseas to come and train them and even import machineries, right? And that then becomes very bad because even if you permit them by per the CBDR principle to still use the resources from crude oil or whatsoever to emancipate, they still need to import certain machineries from these developed nations. In the event where developed nations are already cut off from such productions, it means that they do not have access to such machinery, hence their development per that means is then problematic, denied, and no longer feasible. Second thing to talk about is the nature of climate change. We think that climate change is a global pandemic. It is something that none of us here in today's debate can necessarily deny. From things like heat waves and droughts that we all see around us. Like you go outside and you can feel the heat of the sun. It's not like what it used to be some 10 years ago, 5 years ago, while we were much younger. We cannot deny that fact. Now, the second thing about first is that it is undeniable, and second thing is that it's a global pandemic, which means that contribution from one end of the world can affect another end of the world. Which means that if you say that developed nations should be held culpable, they should go green, they should stop burning fossil fuels, and you still give a leverage per CBDR principle to developing nations who are more likely going to want to abuse it, to just keep doing it to get their funds whatsoever. It means that the effect of climate change is going to be reduced, we concede, but it's going to be affecting other nations who necessarily are not doing that act. That then shifts responsibility and culpability from the causative agent of these problems and shift it to other parts of the world. Last thing, which is the most important thing to talk about within today's debate, why we necessarily oppose the implementation of this principle. We think it is on the principle of shared culpability. What does this mean? It means that if you have benefited in an act of offense over time, we have every right to hold you responsible for that. What does this look like? It looks like a secondary school child who steals from their parents' money and come to school to spend it. We are going to, or when we come to arrest such a child, we are likely going to arrest their friends who have been eating from these funds with them because they have necessarily benefited from this evil. And without that benefit, there is a tendency that such evil acts would have reduced. Why is that important into this debate? We think that all of the burning of fossil fuels and a whole lot of activities that existed over the course of the time within the e.g., when there was colonization in various areas within developing nations before they broke out whatsoever. All of these things were done against climate, but it was done on this land, and these people benefited from it one way or the other. Most technical know-how, most machinery, most advancement that you have in developing nations today are as a result of the effort of their colonizers. That is one. Case two is that there is a huge level of reparations that come from developed nations to developing nations in things like amnesty, in things like scholarship that exist presently in status quo. All of these things are as a result of the huge level of fundings that developed nations have gotten over the years, which is as a result of their illicit acts and evil activity against the climate necessarily. Third thing is that there exists a huge level of dependency on developed nations. When things like flooding happens in developing nations, when things like crisis happen, let's say war, the Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria, when we have people who are living in people who have been destabilized from their homes, who have been sent away. All of these things come from developed nations to serve as succor to developing nations, because developing nations continuously benefit from the ill wealth of these developed nations. We say that they owe a shared culpability to them. This shared culpability cannot be gotten per the CBDR principle because you give them the leverage to continue to harm the society without any culpability. You leave them free to say maybe you do some, or you are not taxed at all for climate change effects whatsoever. No incentive for net zero, etc. POI at this point, please.
So we agree that everyone is culpable, and we are holding everybody culpable by allowing developing countries to still contribute immensely. But then we think that contribution should not be equal, since they don't have equal contribution to the problem itself. Show why this is unjustifiable.
Okay. I think this bit is very simple. We think that the contribution is never going to be equal. There is no way where the United Nations within the net zero treaties and all of these things is going to be billing United States of America say $10 billion, and they're going to bill Nigeria or an African state the same amount. No, it has never been like that. It has never been equal. But what the CBDR principle does is to largely marginalize that gap, right? To minimize their contribution, and to say it's fine for you not to even contribute at all. You need to take the hard line and defend the best case scenario to say that they are going to be contributing far less than what they are contributing presently, or they are going to be left free essentially. That is where the debate lies. We think that the moment where you give them that leverage to say you should not, you are free per the CBDR principle, because that is what it says. It gives them that leverage. It means that they are less likely going to have that incentive to contribute at all in that regard. Why is this problematic? We think that it then limits our possibility of combating climate change in and of itself because of the huge level of contributions that is going to come from this guy, and then you erode culpability. We think it is illegitimate and immoral to remove that culpability from them. Proudly, OJ.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister, for that speech. We call upon leader of opposition to state the case for OO. Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, give me a moment to just set up my timer. All right, so assuming I am still audible. Hello everyone, my name is Sarah. I'm going to be the sorry about that noise. I'm going to be the leader of opposition for this round. My preferred gender pronouns are she, her. But you can call me anything you want, especially if you forget. If you have a PI, just submit and ask. I won't be staring at at the chat space, but I'll be staring at my timer. So Chair, just confirm that I'm audible for one last time.
You are audible.
All right. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. We feel that at the end of the day, when it comes to the level of culpability that third world countries have, when it comes to first world countries, in that regard, we feel that at the end of the day, first world countries are going to bear the brunt of like dealing with climate change issues for a lot of reasons. But we feel also that it is quite important for us to understand that when it comes down to like climate change and all of the problems that climate change has undergone as a result of like mining or the exploitation of fossil fuels, we feel that third world countries didn't have a choice to not even like participate or contribute in as much as first world countries. Why do we think so? We think because of the history of colonialization meant that first world countries came and then they exploited the oil-rich nations of like Africa or like any other sort of like mineral resources they could, and then they carried it off to their places, right? They carried it off to like their countries to develop them and stuff like that. Which means at the end of the day, we feel that to a very large extent, we don't have like argue why certain countries owe like a greater responsibility. Because at the end of the day, the fact remains that first world countries were the ones that actually like exploited third world countries in order to like foster their own economy. So on reparation, I feel like first world countries or third world countries for them to actually like be able to like deal with this particular issue more than they can. But let's move on to like other particular things that probably goes from like OG. Now OG says that developing countries will be able to survive regardless of whether you impose a huger burden for them to combat climate change issues. Now, this is a lie because at the end of the day, if they say some countries have agriculture, we think there are several other like African countries that are struggling that don't have as much resources. For example, countries like Syria. But then even the countries that have like resources, they are dealing with a lot of problems like poor management, like corruption, like he said, and problems of like ethnic discontention and terrorism. So how do you expect these people to combat all of these things and then still combat climate change and then still try to develop? And then like they tell you that because these countries are corrupt innately, right? They are going to struggle anyway. So even if you help them by reducing their burden, they're still going to struggle. But then this just shows us that at the end of the day, this is why you need to like give the responsibility to countries that can't be responsible enough. So what makes you think that these fellow countries are going to take their culpability seriously, since you already mentioned that they are corrupt and like in that regard? So I think what they're going to do is to cry incapacity, right? And then they're going to like hide from this responsibility anyway. So we think that's like on our side of the road, like we are better able to like deal with all of these like issues that OG have. So what does our side look like? We think that our side is what like what when it comes to the implementation of the CBDR principle, like um when it comes to implementing it, it means that first of all, when it comes to like climate change funds, developed countries contribute more than developing countries. Two, when it comes to like tech finding or like tech to actually like abate the issues of climate change, developed countries will contribute more. And then when it comes to like transforming and transitioning to renewable energy, developed countries will be doing more of that. But then what is that special thing about our side of the world? We think that by sort of like giving developed countries bigger burden, right? Definitely they owe the responsibility to ensure that developing countries are able to transition as well. Meaning, the responsibility is not just to themselves, but to ensure that like other developing countries are able to transition. For example, they are going to be subsidizing technology for these particular developing countries. They're going to be granting them reliefs, and this is not like new because in status quo, developing countries are already like giving grants and like money, right, and like other kinds of aid by developing countries. So in that sense, like you just like transition like all of that effort towards like climate change abatement. So that doesn't sound so new. Now let's go into like more, some of like the principles of like sort of like utilities to get from our side of the world. So we're going to be talking about a few things: culpability, capacity, equitability. Now, naturally, I already talked about like how like the developed countries bear more culpability because at the end of the day, like it is obvious from the emotion, right? And the info like that the developed countries are the ones that bear the greater level of culpability, since it is true the exploitation of the oil-rich nations of like third world countries and other African countries in that sense that they were able to like transition into like the industrial technology that they so gladly like show in like status quo. But then also we think on capacity. It seems only fair that the country that has a greater capacity should be given the greater responsibility. It's only moral, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're going to be given like third world countries like a bigger burden, right? The fact that they are incapacitated to carry that burden is a problem because you're not going to get any sort of like benefit in that sense. So to the extent where we want to ensure that climate change issues are solved or abated, then we need to give people who are responsible enough, right, for people who have enough capacity to be able to like create a better change within that regard. So it is obvious to know that it's special countries that have like greater technology, the greater funding to be able to like significantly change climate change issues, right? If they were given an incentive or if they were given the responsibility to do so. Another thing we need to understand is on equitability. So it is only equitable, right, that people with more capacity are able to like be given greater responsibility because it is not about equality. Because if it was about equality, then it should mean that every single person should have the same amount of burden. But equitability shows that what is moral in this sense is it to give a country that is weak a greater than they can like deal with burden or a burden that is just equitable to what they can afford. So we think on equitability like the best sort of like thing we can do is to like ensure that the first world countries have a greater responsibility to deal with
POI.
like climate change issues. Sure, your PI.
Okay,
If
this is
first world
confusing.
countries,
Do you think that that in of itself is like a financial responsibility? Do you think that states just have a financial responsibility necessarily?
All right, for that. Now, like I said, especially in my framing, at the end of the day, it is mostly financial because you're going to be contributing to like a funding that is going to be aimed at like researching better ways to deal with like climate change issues. You're going to be researching in greener energy, right? So you need a lot of finances. So yes, it is financial. But yes, we also think that people owe like responsibilities to like be better like individuals when it comes to like dealing with climate change issues, like keeping your environment cleaner, like ensuring that you don't pollute the environment even more. And that seems like anything that like any individual, like whether first world country or third world country, should be able to deal with. But then like on the greater like responsibility of finances, which like third world countries are always going to shout they cannot like deal with. That is like where the focus is going to be. So I don't think that the issue should even be about whether it's financial or not. Now let's like summarize. Now at the end of the day, I feel like the basis of what we argue is on like the better sustainability, right? Or better option of like how we can even deal like the problem, and decide actually gives you like a better chance of like dealing with the problem, and without being proud to put.
Thank you so much. Hello, we call upon DPM to advance the case for OG. Yeah.
All right. Same things, please. POIs in the chat space. I would gladly take you. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. All of the analysis from side leader of opposition to talk about colonization and expectation shifting of benefit are things I already engaged in my PM speech, right? Making you understand that there's a huge level of reparations that already exist. They say that they owe reparations. We concede to that, but we also say that they have paid this over the years and they are still paying it. The moment where you agree to the CBDR principle, what you do is that you take away culpability from these developed nations. Essentially, it means that they are less likely. There's a less incentive to then begin to supply all of these reparations and aids. Why? Because you already checked out. You are saying that you want to develop yourself the same way they developed through you. You want to develop yourself. That gives them a higher incentive to stay on their own so that they can cater for their own needs, because the cost of climate change control is so high. And if they have to pay so much because we are now paying less or not paying at all, it means they have a low or no incentive to then supply reparations to you. I think I like opening opposition's case when they say that what they want is a transitioning of developing countries. I already told you in my first speech how that the transitioning of these developing countries, given that they concede to all of the problems that exist in the developing countries, the transitioning of developing countries is largely tied to a huge level of support that comes from developed nations, from things like huge investments. And do not let them deceive you when they say that some African countries or developing countries are marginalized because they do not have resources whatsoever. At the very least, these people have human resources, and because they have this huge level of cheap labor, investors will still come in most likely, right? So we think that when they talk about transitioning of developing countries, we need to question how that transition is going to happen. It is then a burden on opposition to prove how transitioning is going to happen if reparations, aid, and technical know-hows, machinery, and support do not necessarily come from developed nations. Given my analysis that developed nations are more likely going to check out of giving all of these reparations because you already agree that you want to transition, you want to develop by yourself per the CBDR principle, you are less likely going to get their support. You do not get that sustainability. When you talk about sustainability and better chance of dealing with the problem, note, at the best case scenario, even when we agree to the CBDR principle, and these developed nations have to combat climate change themselves. Note that they have the funds, they have the capacity to manage these things, but for African nations, because they are still causative agents, they are going to still face this problem more likely. They do not have their funds to manage these problems, no matter how much they amass from whatever wealth they want to get. It is then problematic because aids from developed nations are less likely going to come because they are no longer culpable, they no longer feel that sense of reparation. We think that this reparation should be a forever thing, right? We think that it should not be something that developing nations should cut out from. If you choose to oppose CBDR principle with us on our side, you get the benefit of these reparations. You can always go green if you want to, and they are still likely going to support you because they feel that sense of reparation. The moment where you check out to say, no, we're not the cause of these things, note that African countries have also contributed over time. If you say you're not a part of this and you check out, they are less likely going to give a new reparation. You lose that possibility of sustainability. Up needs to do better on how they get sustainability. Let's do an extension here on alliance and safe space. What does this mean? We think that every developing nation owes a responsibility to themselves per their historical precedence of shared pain of colonization. So every developing nations have a historical background where they were colonized by one person or the other, and their wealth were looted away, etc. Blah blah blah. It then means that you owe a responsibility one to another to ensure peaceful alliance and safe space operation for yourself. The best way for you to get that level of alliance and safe space operation is that you can assure yourself of of a safe community, of a safe haven where you can operate, where your farmlands can boom, where you no longer suffer flooding, where you no longer suffer harsh weather conditions. If And that is why you have things like African Union, a coalition of African states, etc. When developing nations follow the CBDR principle, what they do is that they threaten the sort of alliance that exists amongst themselves, people of this shared pain, because you begin to contribute to your own pain when you cannot create that safe haven for yourself as per developing nations. Why is that problematic? Why this is problematic is that it largely threatens the sustainability of your own state as an individual state, and it threatens the sustainability of your collection as an African union or as a union of developing nations, essentially. Why is this bad? It means that you then have a huge level of responsibility to yourself to begin to manage these spaces, to manage your environment, and that is something that is hugely problematic because your funds cannot be enough to manage it. We think that at that point in time, when you no longer get support from developed nations, it then becomes a huge burden on you to protect your own citizenry and create a safe space for them. A better world is where everybody decides and agrees that climate change is a global problem, and we all check into it and we all begin to contribute our efforts to going green and drastically move from it. In that world, you are more likely going to get reparation like we are getting now. When you have flooding, United Nations can support you. But in their world, on a comparative, when you have flooding or you suffer for drought, we're not going to send you any seedlings. We're not going to come to aid your flood because we are also paying hugely to combat climate change in our world. Because you already told us that you are checking out to transition so that you can develop personally. That sense of responsibility is drastically reduced on our end, and we are less likely going to support you. The huge level of reduction in support from developed nations to developing nations means they are less likely going to succeed. Why does this threaten alliance and safe space within the Union of Developing Nations? We think that it will then get to a time where these developing nations will begin to clash against themselves. Why is this problematic? Fellow developing nations like yourself ought to be your closest ally, ought to be people you can trust because you suffer the same pain. In the event where you then threaten the safe haven, where you then threaten the safe space ideology within your people with the same shared pain, it then becomes a problem. There is going to be a huge level of clash within these developing nations. We think that is something that is largely problematic because it threatens your survival and sustainability as a state. When people who ought to be your closest ally, ought to be your best support, begin to threaten your sustainability, that is something that is largely problematic. We support a world where reparations can continue. We support a world where ethnic tensions and whatsoever can be salvaged by aid from developed nations, and not a world where you boycott and cut off yourself. We think there's a shared culpability. Opening opposition has failed to respond to this. Proudly, Gov.
Thank you so much. GPM will call upon GLO to advance the case for OO. Yeah.
Chair, please confirm if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Let me dedicate my speech to my partner and myself. We have come a long way. So, yeah, I'm going to begin my speech on my first word. POIs by voice, please. Ask anytime you feel like asking. So, panel, OG has been contradictory throughout their speech. First, they say, oh, we think developing countries are over relying on developed countries and it's a bad thing. But then they say, oh, we think reparation should continue forever. Within that in and of itself means that one, they hardly have a standpoint to which they adjudicate their arguments from. Is it from a point where we necessarily liberate developing countries from developed countries, or a world where we continue to allow them to be dependent in that particular regard? But let's take them at their best when they say, oh, we think when you like implement CBDR, are most likely going to say that developing countries are not culpable at all. We think it is true, and we're going to prove that to you. Notice that the problem within developing countries and the contribution that developing countries like have in concern to climate change in of itself is like inherently fostered by developed countries. What does this mean? It means that one, if you look at all developing countries, the sort of machinery that they use, the kind of emission that they produce is all fostered by developed countries, which means the cars on our roads are made by developing countries, that by developed countries and shipped to our countries, and we buy them, right? We don't get them for free and not at a cheap rate, at a very high price for that matter. So they're inherently getting money by inherently forcing us to like kill our own environment in and of itself. But then secondly, you also know that like environment within developing countries is continuously depleting because of things like oil spill, things like environmental degradation that comes from like companies that spill waste into river bodies or inherently cause air pollution in that particular regarding of itself. So when OG tells you, oh, we think developing countries can get better by investing in agriculture, we think we don't even have that particular chance to invest in agriculture in and of itself because one, these companies have depleted the environment to a point where we cannot even like substantially invest into
POI.
agriculture and get something out of it. The only thing that we do in that sort of instance is rely on developing countries to give us job when they create like companies in our own countries and of itself. There's a lot of instances where like multinational companies in Africa are inherently not obeying environmental laws because one, they give us money and they give us job. So we forget about all of the like agricultural investment that opening government talked about. Notice we cannot even invest in agriculture because of those particular problems in of itself. So on the basis of culpability, developed countries are 100% culpable for environmental issues that inherently like happen in developing countries. The only sort of culpability we have is that we allow it. But then the question is, why did we allow it? We allowed it because one, we think that these guys know better than us. And when they project this technology to our own society, we welcome it with open arms and think that it will make our life better. But it doesn't, because it continually makes us subservient to them when we necessarily cannot like use our own resources to our own benefit in vast majority of instances. But then the next thing we need to talk to you about is how this particular responsibility looks like. Oh, they said this responsibility is most likely look like, oh, these guys give aid to African countries and necessarily how we're going to solve like climate issues with that particular like engagement of yourself. I think that is not true. That particular responsibility look like four things. One, that developed countries like create more funding for like environmental issues or contribute more to global relief fund, like contribute more to the global relief fund when it comes to environmental issues in and of itself. That is what my partner already talked about. But then secondly, that they foster like better transitioning in their own environment in and of itself. We think that one, opening government says, oh, environmental problem is a global pandemic, and to that extent, we need to solve it collectively. Notice that that collective like solution to environmental problem is always going to be dependent on how much developed countries are taking upon themselves to one, accept culpability and find solution. Now, developing countries have already understood
POI.
that there's a need to transition into greener energy sources. That is why there is like the huge adoption of electric cars or the huge adoption of solar homes and greener homes in and of itself. We think that this particular transitioning that is happening in developed countries like presently is not enough. They need to like transition faster and better and making sure that one, they can necessarily make sure that they shift this particular like transitioning to developing countries. Notice that they have the resources to transition faster and better. They necessarily have the technical know-how to also transition faster and better. What's the problem then? The problem is that even in their slow-paced transition, they continuously shift the end product of their transition to developing countries. So what happens is they shift the petrol cars to developing countries, they shift the diesel cars to developing countries. So when we contribute to environmental depletion, it looks like we are the ones contributing, but in recent, we're not the ones contributing. We're only suffering the aftermath of their transitioning from like regular energy sources to better renewable energy sources within that sort of instance. You
POI.
think they are culpable? Shoot your POI.
Given that you concede to things like oil spillage and importation of diesel use, all of these things, don't you think you should be held culpable for things you consented to?
So here is the thing, right? One, we don't have alternatives as opposed to like necessarily what we say, let's transition into greener energy sources. We cannot afford it because our economy in of itself is fucked up. We think one, the bigger responsibility on developed countries in that regard is to say, help developing countries transition. How do they help developing countries transition? They necessarily do that by one, not shifting their like their waste product of diesel cars and petrol cars to developing countries, but then necessarily forcing their companies abroad to also take responsibilities in enforcing environmental like policies and obeying environmental laws. Look at this. Multinational companies in developing countries in of itself don't obey environmental laws in of itself, which means that one, there's a quarter of what these guys can do at home. But when they go abroad to developing countries, they don't like respect that like level of quota to their like, emission or their like pollution to the environment in that regard. We think that is a problem. At the point where you hold these guys' responsibility to not just manage the affairs of these capitalists at home, but also manage the affairs of these capitalists abroad, what you do is that you better solve the problem within developing countries in that regard. Within developing countries can then fend for themselves when one they don't necessarily get that particular reparation that OG has been hammering on since. We think the only problem here is that one, we focus on what these guys are giving us because we don't have an alternative. At the point where our environment is cleaner, our water bodies is cleaner, our health is cleaner, we can then opt into agriculture and inherently like not suffer from those particular environmental like problems of itself. We think then if we contribute to environmental problem, we can be held accountable and we can contribute and take responsibility for it better on our side. Proud OO.
Thank you so much, Jello, for that speech. Now the opening half is ended. We call upon member of government to start the closing half. Yeah.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yeah. Audio.
I'm really sorry. I'm down with like a flu, so it's really cold. So I'm gonna try my best to speak as loud as possible, but I will try. I will just generally just try to be calm enough so that you can hear me and I can articulate myself well. If you do have a POI, please just put it. Just unmute it at me because I generally won't be seeing the text space. I will also be running on external time. Okay, I'm going to start the speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to just want to say humor me. There is a deadlock in the opening half because it is unclear what the CBR implementation particularly looks like. Why is this true? How the CBR implementation looks like is very, very different from what these people say. OO focuses on that implementation only in developed countries. OG focuses on that manifestation in developing countries. But here's the key nuance. The CBR principle entails different obligations from these specific countries and the prioritization of those obligations. What do I mean by this? The CBR principle says that developed countries are more culpable. This means that they hold a higher obligation in protecting the environment. The problem is how it gets implemented is that it's only development within their particular countries. It is a huge injection of a lot of money within their economies. It's a huge injection in organizations like the Paris Agreement and having a lot of resources in those specific countries. The comparative is that when the CPR is implemented in developing countries, they feel like they have a less obligation to protect the environment. This means that because the obligations are reduced on them, they have the ability to indulge in things like continuously destroying the environment, having unsustainable methods. Because notice, they historically don't have that contribution because they never had the industrial revolution benefit them, the developed countries have. That is to say, when you implement the CPR, you foster an environment for continuous degradation of the environment from developing countries because they believe that they don't have the same obligation like developed countries. why is this key? That's why this piece of analysis really important. I think it does two things. I think one, it speaks to this so-called shift that DLO tries to talk about. Because if it is true that developed countries now have electric cars, in your developing countries you don't have electric cars because since you didn't have the same obligation, you are not trying to solve climate change in your particular country. That's the problem that happens. And I think the direct impact you already see here
You're right.
is that there's continuous degradation and environmental destroying, like within developing countries, which is particularly bad because you don't protect the environment. Why? We simply don't have that obligation. I think why is this much better than our opening? Opening claims that there is a reparation. I'm not saying this is not true, but reparation is symmetric. They needed to explain why there's a specific incentive for this reparation to continue. But the second thing is that I think on our side, because you see, the comparative is that on our side, all countries are culpable. We don't look at the degree. It means that your the obligations on each and every one are the same. It means that when you're stopping to use coal in Australia, you also stop using coal in South Africa. You force South Africa to think of more sustainable methods. And this is the benefit. The benefit is that with the huge amount of funds being
You're
put in,
right.
keep quiet, with the full amount of funds being put in things like the Paris Agreement, African countries are able to tap and have access into the huge pool of resources that developed countries like give to these international organizations. This means that we also have the similar cash injection. It means that developing countries will be forced to also see the development of electric cars because now you stop them from accessing the methods that were
You're
harmful to
right.
the environment. The problem is that even if it looks pretty on that on opposition, it is bad because you continuously enable the degradation of the environment. It's an exclusive
You
extension
are.
that you get, guys, stop badgering. This is exclusive extension you get from CG and how it's different. But the second thing that you're going to get from us here is why this just doesn't solve climate change at all. But before I do that, I want to take CO. CO. All right, I'll take OO.
So very simple. The reason why we are not responsible now is because we still think that these guys are responsible for our problem. At the
Yeah,
point where developed countries take responsibility and help us solve those problems, they can
but
then hold us responsible within developing countries.
the problem with your analysis is that it fits into what I've said. Because if we're not culpable now, when Elon Musk and all these developed countries are going to sell us those electric cars at high amounts of money, it means in the long run we still lose money. If right now we have the same amount of culpability, it means that we also develop those electric cars now. We also develop the technology now so that it's not sold to us at high amounts in the future. That's your problem. When you hear that USA is like has a more historical impact in climate change, the USA only solves the problems in their country, not the fucking problems in African countries, not the fucking problem in developing countries. Your landslides continue. That's the problem on your side that you're not trying to understand. So our case takes you at your very best. The second extension was that how this does not simply solve climate change. A couple of mechanisms here. The first is that there's just cognitive dissonance from these countries. Why? Countries are inherently selfish like individuals. They never want to accept culpability. So even when they try to solve climate change in their particular country, climate change within developing countries, which are the majority, is not solved because for them they are still continuously destroying the environment because they feel like they don't have the same obligation. The second thing, it is simply still profitable to destroy the environment even when you have the CBR. Why? Because you could simply employ slower methods of reducing your carbon footprint while you still make money off it. Third mechanism, that it just creates entitlement by developed countries. Why? Because developed countries get to set the timeline at which you help solve climate change. And they also have selfish interests because they hold the most MNCs and big corporations. It means that you are unlikely to solve climate change even when you implement the CBR. Because all the developing countries, I still have I'm at 6:54. I was running an external time. I just want to clarify. I someone told me I have to like time up, yet even the time and the chat is still running. It was that like 20 seconds. But hey, all right. So I was cut short. I'll just end my
You
speech.
can have your 30 seconds. I'll time you externally.
All right. I'm gonna continue I'm gonna just wait, I lost my train of thought. Let me see what idea I was explaining. Okay, I'm just going to continue in 3, 2, 1. So the chat is simple, but there's a reduced obligation. The case from CG should just be very, very simple. It's practical that the CBR reduces the obligation we have, which means we lose all the huge cash injections which can come. It is better to be uncomfortable and be protected in the long run, because in the long run we lose out financially because we become price takers to that new developed technology that all claims. Proud to be CG.
Thank you so much, member of CAV. With that being said, we call upon member of OP to set the case for closing opposition. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. So we want to show you what kind of world we're looking at. We want to show you what kind of world that we're living in. We want to tell you about the current status quo. So this is how we're gonna do it. We want to look at how already we're living in a world where already climate change is taking place. We're living in a world where already some countries are going through a lot of drought. We're living in a world where children are dying, women are dying. We're living in a world where even men are a cause of concern currently because they cannot even find work. Why? Because of how much of the planet is being degraded and how much the planet is currently suffering. We're living in a world where children cannot really go to school. Why? Because there is poverty. We're living in a world where it's not just climate change. We're living in a world where, because of climate change, there are issues like period poverty, there are issues like lack of education, there are issues like child marriages, there are issues like outbreaks of diseases and there are pandemics that are just rising. Why? Because the earth is not good, because the earth has suffered so much, and because there are so many problems that have been caused by this. Right? We want you to really understand that it is okay. So I'm gonna take you later for the POS. So we're living in a world where there's a lot that is happening because of this climate change. There are a lot of damages that have been caused by this climate change, right? And then we also want you to understand that climate change only took place because of the land degradation. That didn't start now, but it started a long time ago, right? It started when there were different countries that started industrializing, and then they thought that their resources are not enough. That is the reason why they then decided to go to other continents to then get more raw material. Now, if you're going to be excavating raw material, it means that you're degrading the environment. It means that you are creating cracks and spills in oceans. Why? Because you want to then extract the oils that are under there. It means that you're going to be a China that goes to Zimbabwe to look for lithium, right? At the end of the day, Zimbabwe is going to be said is the one that is causing air pollution because of the carbon emissions and whatnot. But it is China, which is the perpetuator, that is actually in Zimbabwe trying to extract all these minerals to use them for their own personal responsibilities, right? And at the end of the day, it is Zimbabwe who has to suffer at the end of the day for these carbon emissions in their side of the world, right? So China does dare not take the responsibility for this, right? We're living in a world where we have African countries having sanctions. We have African countries having large disparities in the trade sector, right? So these are like my rebuttals in terms of whatever or what was being said by the government side, by the other bank side, right? So we want to tell you about how sanctions then make it very difficult for the third world countries, but then the other African countries that did not put much into the environment, right? We tell you about how you have a country like Zimbabwe. Okay, you expect Zimbabwe to then pump in resources, a lot of resources into sustaining the environment, and yet Zimbabwe is already under sanctions. Already Zimbabwe cannot be trading in order to generate income, in order for then at the end of the day to then perpetuate all these good things that we want to save the environment and the planet at the end of the day, right? So if Zimbabwe is not then positioned, is not in the best capabilities and in the best positioning to then perpetuate this solution at the end of the day, it means that we're not doing anything at the end of the day. So kind of this is what we want to give you. This is the kind of world that we want to give you. We want to give you a kind of 60-40% kind of setup, right? We want these other countries that already have high carbon emissions, high historical background of degrading the environment, to then put more into then solving, into then giving solutions into the environment. How on a 60-40 basis, we want then this Eurocentric side to then use 60% of their resources to then help the environment at the end of the day, and then for African countries to at least use 40%. Why? Because that is what they then have, right? At the end of the day, we want you to understand what our the info slide is telling us. Our info slide is telling us that they have respective capacities. To say that even if these other countries in the CBD have resources that are more than those in the African side, that have less, right? South Africa is still going to try and use more resources than Zimbabwe because South Africa has more funds, because South Africa is more progressed, because South Africa is more developed than Zimbabwe. But then this does not mean that South Africa then used caused a lot of land. It only means that South Africa has the best capabilities and is in a respective capacity to address such issues as climate change. Why? Because it has the capacities, right? So what we're saying is that we're not devaluing then at the end of the day the ability for developing countries to then assist in helping the environment. What we are saying is that we have a spectrum, we have different capabilities. It means that we have different historical obligations to then own up to our mistakes, because morally it is right for you to take up responsibility for the problems that you caused at the end of the day. So with the resources that you stole, with the resources that you extracted, you might as well use them to then solve a problem, right? We want to tell you about the politics, what we value in this debate. Value continuity of life, value sustainability of life, and it comes better in our side of the world. Why? Because we're actually telling you how both sides of the world can be used in a respective way to then help at the end of the day, which is very equal, which is equity, which is how it better then works for us to then help, right? So our stakeholders in this debate are the global citizens, but they are mainly children and everyone else because they're the future generation, right? So we tell you about the political implications of these leaders taking up more responsibility. It's because in those developed countries, they have more influence on people, right? In those developed countries, they have much power. They have more resources, so they can influence the rest of the world to take up certain obligations. They can influence the rest of the world to do certain things, right? This is the reason why we then believe that they should then, at the end of the day, be the ones that perpetuate this change that we need to see. We talk about the economic setup. They have more resources already because of the degradation that they caused already, which is the reason why they should then be the ones that then have more resources that they pump into us. We talk about the social responsibilities. We can't be forcing African countries to pump in resources when African countries are actually trying to actually sustain themselves at the end of the day in with this result case. Hello?
Thank you so much, member of OP. We call upon government whip to conclude the case for the government bench. Yeah.
So I just want to confirm if I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. Stop banning my files. Just want to find where to place it. Yeah, that's much better. Oh, not better. Better. Am I still audible now? audible.
We can hear you. I'm not sure if you can hear us, but we can hear you.
Amazing. Sorry, just a small network glitch. If you have a POI, please do not unmute. It's not cool. Just drop it in the chat. I'll take it when I feel like. I'll start when I'm ready. I don't know. I think there's a very genuine reason why I'm going to engage Upbench as a whole and not separately. CO has no extension. The reason why that's true is that even if you're going to credit the impacts that you get, you can only credit them if you take the mechanization opening opposition presents to that debate. What's worse is that CO throws a bunch of impacts, but never mechanizes those impacts. So they say this is going to happen, not explaining how. This is going to happen, not explaining how. Bit funny, right? And I'm just going to engage them now at the best case scenario they have. They say there's a lot of climatic concerns and people are suffering. And I think this speaks to what James was telling you earlier. The reason why these guys are comfortably seated is because there is still the common belief. And this is the thing. In this house oppose or supports motion, you either support or oppose something that is currently ongoing. The CBDR principle is not necessarily a new concept, especially it becomes bad when OO and CO want to debate it like a new concept. It's not new. This concept has existed in most of the climatic deal agreements. If you look at all the discussions at COP, most of the discussions are about the biggest emitters having a bigger role to play. If you look at the Kyoto Protocol, the biggest aspect of that protocol was that the biggest emitters have to actually do the biggest responsibility. Here's why we oppose it. The exact things that CO says in her member of opposition speech, that people are suffering now because states believe there is not much obligation. Concur with them that the people in sub-Saharan region that are working to find food to survive, while guys in Europe are working for fitness. The comparative is that these guys were able to fix their problems, and they believe that when you believe you all have a shared responsibility, equal contribution, two things most likely happen. Because you share the same ozone layer and you've come at that realization, you are most likely going to be able now to be the person that is going to also work on your own problems. African problems are not European problems. So even if you buy into the analysis that opening opposition provides on you now get more money for help, I don't think it is sufficient. Even if it doesn't mechanize how that help materializes, let me just give you that mechanization for you for his sake. And probably, if you're going to get that help, it's going to be out of the fact that you have a responsibility to help other people become better. I still think that doesn't work because European people don't have an understanding of what African climate problems are. These guys don't experience landslides. Part of Bangladesh is submerged into water. Means if these guys are to help people in Bangladesh, they don't have a clue on how these individuals' problems are, serious they are, and how they have to be solved. Second, for this argument to have stood from opening opposition, they needed to show you why these bigger emitters are now going to see these guys' problems as serious problems, especially because when you say they have the biggest role to play, make the problems that happen within their country that are climate related the bigger problems. It means in COP discussion, you don't have discussions of people in sub-Saharan region who can't eat or part of Bangladesh submerged into water. You have a discussion of people in China who probably cannot breathe stuffed air. Here's the problem. Those guys already have technology anyways to solve their problem. There's a beautiful piece of analysis and extension that James explains to you the rate at which they do those things. Because you have shown them that their issues are they're the biggest players to like sort of like cater for climate problems, they are most likely going to now fix their problems further. It simply means then
Johan,
that you and everybody else, you are far lagging behind on solving those particular problems. Oh.
very simple, right? We established that developing countries can only fight their problem where they have some level of transitioning from that sort of like activities that erode their environment to a better renewable energy sources. I would think it is the responsibility
Yeah,
of
but yeah,
developing
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah,
developed
yeah, yeah.
countries
But yeah,
to
yeah,
help
yeah.
that
It's not
transition.
a debate. You had 7 minutes, Matthew. Shut up. The thing is that I think for the most part, James already analyzes how that transition may most likely be hard. You guys don't analyze how that transition becomes easy. And this is very important in adjudication because both the teams on like CO and OO shouldn't be able to like be automatically proceeding for very simple reasons. Is that has never analyzed to you how that help is going to now come to other countries. The problem here is that James is able to show you how that help won't reach. He even gives you a best case scenario that even if that help was to reach, things are going to be freaking expensive because you guys have shown them that they should invest more in that side. You who's not investing into making transition to green technology, involving yourself in the market because you don't have a bigger role to play, you worsen that situation on that particular regard. James analyzes cognitive dissonance that even CEO hasn't engaged with at this point. How you have a second obligation, how the entitlement to create the time, the enslavement that exists of your urgency to make climate decisions that accrue to you. Because these guys have a bigger role to play, you give them the moral justification to now determine how you should solve your problems. Mechanization appeared and told you these guys have no fucking clue what those things look like. So it means there's a problem solution mismatch in your world because the people who are trying to solve your problem, who you want to help you, don't give you things that necessarily are supposed to innately solve your problems. And I think from that point, you make the world far, far much worse.
Um, Thank you so much, Gavip. Please, let's respect debate etiquette. Be nice to one another. Number two, let's respect people's PY preferences. Number three, please look at the timer. Don't go over time. Call your point. Upwip.
Uh, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Yes,
you.
we
We are
can
not
hear you.
able to hear us.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So panel, when we first got this motion, we asked ourselves 3 questions. Basically, we looked at the nuance surrounding climate change. Why was the CBDR put, like, why was this suggested in the first place? And then thirdly, like the nuances surrounding nations in and of themselves, like the ones that are supposed to contribute to this. But then in this debate, right, we heard what OG came here to say. They spoke about how developing problems already have all of these problems, right? They have corruption, they have political problems, they have economic problems. They characterize that, right? And then they come and then they tell us that these developing nations are dependent on these developed nations, which is true. We concede to that. And we actually feel like that was important in this debate, right? And then we also got analysis in terms of like colonization and how colonization actually played a factor into the world that we see today, and like how we then are going to factor in how we're going to actually tackle climate change, right? And then we get analysis from how there's individuals like politically, like in terms of like corruption, and like how they also factor into how the decision making around climate change, right? So then we get a CG that comes and tells us that it's obligation. We have to put obligation on people, obligation, and then they don't really offer up like how we're going to turn that obligation into actually combating climate change at the end of the day. Because you can give someone all the obligation in the world, but if the money is not there, it's not there, right? So what you get from CEO in this debate, right? We spoke about like how there's already economic disparity in terms of like how these countries are set up, right? Not even like historically, like OO was focusing on, right? We're speaking about currently, right? Currently, countries are under sanctions, right? We'll tell you that in terms of trade, right? There's a lot of countries in Africa that cannot do certain things because they're being oppressed right now. Right now, in terms of carbon footprint and their contributions to climate change are not solely on these countries, these developing nations that you want to put this obligation on, right? Yes, it affects everyone. But then we need to understand that there's a few people that are responsible for the damage that we're in, right? The countries that industrialized through the industrial revolution that have been still like right now, if Germany is in Sri Lanka mining lithium or mining whatever they're mining, it's not Sri Lanka that is doing that. It is actually Germany, right? Or all of these other developed nations, right? We speak about how there's countries like Somalia, for example, that is going through the harshest climate change issues, right? And then they're suffering floods, they're suffering drought, they're suffering all of these things. Then to turn around and say, oh yeah, despite you guys not being capable of contributing, we still want to put that obligation on you. We feel like that is unfair from government side, and that will just only lead to like countries owing, perpetually like having debts, basically, to say because the money is actually not there, right? We'll give you an example of like if there's a broken window in the classroom, right, and everybody is freezing and you can't learn, right, and then there's students that actually have $5. It takes $20 to contribute, and there's students that don't have money, and we say everybody has the obligation to, right? We actually feel like we'll go months without fixing that window because the people that are trying to catch up will never catch up to be able to contribute, right? So we actually favor for you to actually say, okay, whoever has the money. That's why fundraisers work the way that they work, right? And then we also spoke about like how, like in terms of historical resolution, in terms of how these countries are the ones that colonize nations, right? It's a sort of historical like climate justice, because this is a care-based industry, right? In terms of like if African politicians feel as if this is oppression and they will not, like these individuals that CG mentions, the reason why they're holding back progress is because they feel as if they're still being oppressed, and they want European countries and Western developed countries to know that like, you guys are still currently oppressing us. So they will slow down and they will not want to contribute. But if you sit down and say, no, we know what we did to you. You guys are in this situation because of us. Let us help you to industrialize via other routes that are not like that OO was mentioning in terms of like the trickle down factor, right? Where developed nations actually, there's an incentive to actually help developed nations catch up, right? Instead of just like forcing them to contribute when they're also trying to catch up in terms of like service provision at the end of the day. Because these global power dynamics do matter in this debate, right? We'll actually speak about how like the current exploitation and like the way that countries are set up right now is actually what's stopping nations from actually contributing at the end of the day. So if we just put obligation on people, we will not go anywhere. And the day people are still dying and people are still suffering from climate change, right? But we actually would rather have a world in which we actually give countries a spectrum of responsibility, right? Due to your respective capacities, because the importance of capacity in this debate panel. If nations do not have the funds to allocate to climate change, then they will not allocate that money to climate change. Like it's as simple as that. You can give them all the obligation in the world, the CG said, right? Because they're trying to basically say by giving someone obligation, it's going to lead somewhere. But we'll tell you that like you put too much obligation on someone to do something and they don't have the money, they will feel negatively towards that. And we actually want people to feel positively towards that. And we feel like implementing the CBDR is actually something that will actually help and like help people feel positively towards contributing, right? And then we tell you about like how like these developing nations, right? They're unable to actually government like wants to view this problem as if it occurs in a bubble. Like climate change is the only problem that nations have to deal with, and like countries can just like go into a vacuum where they can just focus on climate change only, when countries are actually dealing with a million other problems at the same time concurrently. So then for you, when they have other things that are going on in terms of like they mentioned things like Boko Haram, from OO, they mentioned a lot of other things that are going on in these nations. So for countries to then sit down and say, okay, now we're dealing with climate change, they have to have dealt with other issues. So we feel like there's a more incentive if we put less burden on some of the countries that need that don't need the burden on them. We feel like they can help solve their issues, and then they can come to the table when the funds are there, right? So what you get from closing opposition in this debate, right? We actually show you that the government case is not really mechanizable in terms of like obligation. Like we tell you that you're supposed to contribute, we tell you they're supposed to contribute, when the info slide is actually clearly showing us that CBDR has a mechanization that shows already that like this could actually benefit and actually have people contributing, because countries are going to be assessed. Countries are going to be like, okay, how much can you contribute? How much can you contribute? And then we can actually move forward. Unlike just saying, okay, everybody has a shared responsibility, and then we start attacking each other, and there's still no money at the end of the day. So that's what you get from this debate, and we thank you.
Thank you so much, guys, for such a wonderful debate. Yes, wish you the best of luck in breaks. If you proceed, well done. Judges, deliberation room.